Hello world, curses and madness be upon you all my friends. I am Euclidean Vision, the emotional support, back to your regularly scheduled nonsense with the first of at least 4 videos regarding Overwatch 2's enemy factions and PvE units. Now, not only do I feel that we need some variance in the types and motivations of our current enemy factions as they are, I think it's also really important that the enemies themselves are engaging to fight if we're going to be building like an entire PvE experience around them. My biggest issue thus far is that most enemy units on show just deal damage in not too many varying ways. So we're going to look at the existing units and how to potentially upgrade them, then have a look at some ideas for some new ones. The 4 factions I've come to for setting out this idea will be explored individually in each of the 4+ videos, but to give you a summary for what's to come, the factions that I'm going to be designing these units around will be Null Sector, Talon, the Junkers, and the Petrus forces of the UN. I came to these decisions in order to represent like a collection of attitudes to contrast Overwatch against, and to allow me to encompass like as many outlying agents in the world as I can within like a relatively succinct framework. I do also believe that these factions are like different enough to end up eventually combating each other at some point as well. I'll go into each of their probable motivations and reasonings briefly in their own videos, but we're going to start with the most familiar groups and work onwards as we go, which means today we're going to be jumping right into the Null Sector. And in contrast to the other factions on offer, I feel Null Sector's distinctive features are their focus on the importance of their own kind, and their more ideologically motivated actions, theoretically. These may also be contradicted by the manner in which they wage war, and so they sort of fall in with most of the other factions in the universe by being focused on achieving ends rather than the means by which they do so. I do imagine they've got the potential to become sympathetic or at least provoke moral questions in the future, but there's so much we have to learn about why they're waging war in the first place that that's pretty uncertain right now. But what is pretty certain is that we're going to be fighting them. Lots of them. So, onwards. Into the fray we go. Starting with the Grunts, the Chaff, the Mooks, the Nullifiers, previously known as Null Troopers, which suggests they're now sort of seen far more as tools rather than any kind of living being. Regardless, these units make up the bulk of the base troops that we're going to be fighting in Overwatch 2. And I guess they don't really need many improvements. Their purpose really is just to induce pressure, deal chip damage, and with such simple units, like this can largely be achieved with just numbers and positioning. Like, you could obviously make just alternate versions of simple weapon changes, rapid fire weapons, beams, explosive projectiles of some form. Like, there's a few options there just to diversify those simple units, but I don't think it really should be anything too massive. But at least something would be nice. So then, to look at another chaff type unit, the Slicers. These are usually way more objective focused, so I think that we can play with these a bit more. Like maybe improving their utility somewhat by making their beams heal their allies, so you got like a healer slicer, or they could link together to form like a damaging fence, or like area denial, or maybe several slicers together could jump onto a player to weigh them down and pin them to the floor, so sort of like some CC in there. Or we could just improve their general combat effectiveness, so they diversify away from the objective focus, and we could look at maybe giving them some mobility, like just maybe a little hop with their little chicken legs, or we can maybe have them do sort of like a backflip while firing their laser to do some sort of crazy beam blade circle slice. Like, we could even see them pool their resources together, cross the streams to form one large focused beam, or like a spirit bomb. And yes, of course, that idea is going to come up again, but not just yet. So now we're going to move on to the potentially obsolete Eradicators, which I'm sort of gutted to not see return or maybe even be reworked, as it suggests that utility options are going to be reduced for the PvE units. Like, barriers and healing are things that the enemies should absolutely get access to, if you ask me. That'd be way more engaging, ultimately. Like, so if we want to bring them back in somehow, we could make them just a pure barrier unit, but maybe give them higher mobility, make them like floating or something, or give them like some melee focus so they lack range, so we have that sort of balance there. Like, we could use like a Bob style rushdown, or some kind of punch maneuver, or flinging the barrier as like a projectile, something like that. Or maybe you can make it an artillery unit so it doesn't deal direct projectile damage and it sets up areas that you can see on the ground that missiles are going to drop on. Or, like I said with the barrier thing, like maybe make it a bit more like Sigma, have it project its barrier at a distance and then you have the balance of moving past the barrier to take out its projector. Or you could even add something to that barrier, making it a physical object, giving it some knockback, things like that. And a few of those ideas could apply to their sort of tanky laser beam cousins in the Obliterators, one of the new units. They could also play with things like artillery strikes or maybe like tractor beams, but they could also gain their own sort of barrier, maybe just like a spherical barrier that surrounds them, and then they could function like the Fire Ox mech from Silent Bomber, if anyone has played that PS1 era game. But then you could have like damaging slide attacks. They've got this really cool sort of floaty big leg mobility sort of thing going on. Like if you're going to take away from their shooting a little by giving them all these extra things, giving them some extra mobility to sort of charge through enemies. And that being said, you could even use their guns for mobility, like Ash's coach gun, having them shoot the floor, leave a big crater, maybe an electrified field crater like the Behemoth that we'll talk about in a bit, Behemoth, whichever. And obviously that could sort of work like Winston, landing in a sort of AoE ground pound, or more like Hammond. Or you could have just the guns spin on the axis of the legs for sort of a close range spin. Like, I really like both of these units because they both feature elements of their hitbox that you can damage individually. And that's something I'd like to see more of going forward as well. Like, it'd be cool if it worked sort of like Horizon Zero Dawn, for instance. Like, allowing certain broken body parts to be used as temporary or even like permanent weapons. Like, think of the Eradicator. If you break its barrier projector off of its body before you kill the main body, then it could drop a barrier pickup, for instance. Just like a little idea of how sort of different kinds of engagement between enemies and the players could work out. Like, they're obviously quite important as well. So thinking of other interactions, let's apply that to some other units, like the Detonator. Like, is that what this little guy's meant to be? Like, he's lost a bit of weight. Like, is this more like a boomer now? Either way, a health sink that achieves like a single focused purpose can be made to operate in a number of different ways. Like, the Detonator, for instance, deals huge damage to objective targets. So how about like a mine layer that denies objective access, like Hammond? Or a rocket pod that provides artillery support from afar, sort of, again, area denial like I spoke about with the Eradicator. Or maybe going more supportive, like if it's just a floaty drone, like make it anything, like a floating supercharger, or a floating speed booster, or a floating shield generator. What about like a life link, like just a massive health sink that ties to all nearby units and takes half of their damage? Or, you know, why not even just make it a heal bot, just a floating boring Lucio? Like, what about a defense matrix drone? That'd be pretty cool, right? Like, so many people would hate that idea. I think that'd be great. I think it'd be interesting to play against. Or if not defense matrix, like rotating barriers or something like that. It's a drone that achieves like this singular purpose. Like, these are all things that can prompt varying responses at the players, giving them priorities in the enemies they need to fight and like how they fight them. All these different things. Like, there's this one unit that has all these varying differentiations, and it's always different to fight whenever you come across it. But my final idea for this little dude, like, I kind of forgot about this. This little guy looks awfully like a Metroid to me. So my final idea for what I think is the Detonator is a supportive unit that resurrects other Null Sector units, attaching to them to give them new life, but providing a shortcut to the player fighting that resurrected enemy in taking out the Metroid that's sort of perched on top of their head, controlling them, for instance. Defeating just the unit itself, so if you kill them, say, by body shots, could even see the Metroid like refresh its health pool or something to go and search for new targets. So you could make a really interesting encounter out of this. If you keep the health low or don't regen it in any way, you make it a simple single res target. Or you could make like a huge boss encounter out of it, where you have to kill the main body a few times and it progresses the Metroid sort of power level. Like, that could be really fun. That totally depends on what they want to actually do with the game, and would come down to loads of testing to figure out how that would all work. So let's move on to the new cast, the new enemies that have come up from the Overwatch 2 demo and the concept art. I've already done the Obliterators, so let's do the Skirmishers. The flitty little bastards jump in on and off the floor, throwing grenades and stuff. Like, let's just give them cluster bombs. Why not? Like, again, more area denial sort of tactics. As they've got those sort of little wing arms, almost like blades, you could have them do sort of melee dashes, put themselves in more danger, but getting more damage out, more engaging to come up against, sort of diverting your attention different ways. As they have the little rocket boosters on their back, we could have a little AoE knockback when they sort of jump up into the air, maybe only at like higher difficulties. Like, that's something I think is really important, that the higher the difficulties get, maybe the more abilities that these enemies show off. That would be really interesting. And I kind of think with the Skirmishers, an interesting mechanic you could employ would be when they're at low health, if you leave them alone long enough, they will try to sort of dive tackle you out of the sky and explode. And you could then maybe use that to your advantage if it dealt damage to the enemy units as well. So you can try and bait out like a self-destruct dive, dodge it, group up a bunch of enemies around it, deal massive extra damage. And my final one for Skirmishers is another one I think that could only maybe activate at low HP, and whether this is again like a boss encounter or just a very special circumstance, say you get 5 Skirmishers to low health but not dead, you could have them form into like a Megazord or a Voltron or whatever. Like, they seem the perfect unit design for that sort of thing. Combo them together, make a sort of boss encounter with way more sort of actual physical attacks, maybe a bit more like a Doomfist. But then breaking it back down a little bit, back to some smaller, flittier bastards. The Orbiters, the little sort of swarm drones. And I think you could have these work almost sort of more like a bullet hell, where they line up in specific formations to make particular attack animations, like little triangles for dive attacks, going into a circle for a rapid fire sort of attack. You could maybe even have it if, you know, a certain amount attached to you, you get pinned to the ground, or you get slowed, or various other things. Like, I don't think it's enough that they just fly around sort of peppering you with lasers. It's a bit boring. There's way more you could probably do with these. Like, judging by like the size and shape of them as they're sort of drones, you could maybe have them attached to nearby units as turrets, like sort of shoulder turrets like Predator, or they could turn into sort of like repair packs. So again, another healer unit, some of the smaller, chaffier, harder to hit units, providing support for the enemies that you're fighting. But as ever, I've got to try and combine things together, so you stick a bunch of these actually together instead of sort of snaking after each other in the sky, and you could make sort of like a Null Leviathan, like a big sort of flying snake dragony sort of thing, with say a super powerful head and tail laser, for example, along with their still sort of peppery little lasers firing out from on their body. You can maybe have like a Sidewinder strike, dealing massive melee damage over an area. Make this more like a Dark Souls boss. Like, you have to learn these really complex and like varied attack patterns to actually fight this thing. But maybe as it's made up of several units, the more you damage it, the smaller its hitbox becomes, or the faster it becomes, things like that. Or it obviously could have like particular weak points at the head and tail, for instance. You can even have it sort of self-destruct various pieces of itself in like a bombing run to increase its speed or shrink its hitbox, like I mentioned. I think there's loads of ways you could play with the smaller units combining into bigger ones. But now onto the sort of the more defined units that we actually haven't seen much of. We've only seen like the concept art. And this one is one of my favourites. I really like the design of this one. I call this one the Null Chakram. And I can see this little floaty guy working quite like either Scythe or Draven from League of Legends. In the way of Scythe, sort of maybe like a boomerang blade would be pretty interesting, or a ricocheting blade. And Draven, in the where it throws its Chakram blade, it may have to travel to where it bounces to catch it, and maybe that increases its attack power for the next strike, or it weakens it while it doesn't have the Chakram, and maybe you can destroy the Chakram and you get a special pickup out of it, something like that. But then you could play with what the Chakram does, aside from being just, I imagine, like a flying, mentally controlled blade, or a boomerang blade, that sort of thing. Like, what if holding it at the center allows the Omnic to focus energy, for instance, or to catch enemy projectiles, to catch your projectiles, to then fling back at you with the Chakram for like an exploding attack, for instance. You could even at higher levels have a special move where it throws the Chakram and it's able to teleport to where the Chakram flies, so it's got a hugely useful mobility option. And these crazy like rocket leg things could see it doing large dash attacks, maybe leaving fiery trails on the floor, or some sort of AoE knockback as it flies into the air and hovers around. And then on to what I think is going to be one of the more supportive units that we haven't seen anything from yet. I call this the Null Sage. This I can see sort of being more like a commander type unit, with maybe some sorts of auras like healing or speed, and maybe playing with sort of energy waves or sort of gravity attacks, CC, like there's not going to be a lot of damage coming out of this thing that's going to have a lot of utility. Any attacks it does do, I can see working maybe like Lux from League of Legends with her beam, her rooting orb, and maybe even him throwing the orb off the top of his staff, which I imagine is like an Omnic energy core, like we saw in Infiltration, possibly, not sure. But if he were to say throw the core to an ally unit, it empowers them in some way, maybe gives them a Zarya bubble, who knows. But we could also maybe see it work sort of like Dark Souls spells, in that he focuses energy into the orb, and that then makes particular kinds of projectiles for you to fight against, unsure. And then onto one I'm actually way more sure about. This little guy I call the Null Roller, and very simply, it's like the Droidica from the Star Wars prequels. This is a mini Wrecking Ball. It'll have Wrecking Balls, fiery, roll mode, and might have a ground slam, maybe, but it'll just kind of be like a mobility unit, knocking you around, causing mischief, shooting you up with its laser hands. Could maybe give it sort of a spherical shield that emanates from its body, like there's a turtle character, I think, in Paladins that has something of that like, where they emanate a spherical shield from their actual body, and they can move around while it's out. So yeah, that could be pretty annoying. That's the purpose. I like it. I think that one's really simple. That, to me, is just really clear as to what that does. It might not, obviously. So, onto one could be a bit more clear. The Null Pantera. And this thing, to me, just screams Metal Garurumon, for all you old Digimon fans. Its face is a laser. Its face is literally a laser. It could have some sort of pounce mechanic, like the Talon Assassin. You could have some sort of energy claw, AoE projectile attacks, shooting rockets from its belly in homage. Like, there's plenty of things you could do with this thing. Like, what about Shadow from Devil May Cry? The sort of shape-shifting panther, circular saw, blade, shadow thing. Yeah, that guy. Maybe if you could play with that, you could definitely see some sort of Transformers-esque shape-shifting going on with this thing to change into a few sort of different small but distinct animals, each with a particular moveset. And thinking of transforming, let's move on to the Null Wraith with their pretty funky looking scythe blade thing. It hugely reminds me of Gehrman's Burial Blade from Bloodborne, and the amygdalan arm, actually, in its sort of arm form, with the clipping in and out. I wonder what that actually does, like changes it from a scythe to a question mark. Sort of reminds me of how the saw cleaver works as well. I mean, could it work sort of like Jace from League of Legends, in that it's a physical weapon that changes into a gun, for instance? Like when the scythe blade retracts, that's actually the butt of a rifle, something like that. So it's like a close range melee crazy AoE scythe blade mistress robot that also can just turn their scythe into a sniper rifle and ping you. Okay, I really want to see what this unit is. Like, the Null Wraith and the Null Chakram are the two that I'm most interested in ultimately. But then on to one that we actually know a bit more about, but that I wanted to save for the end because it's one of the big boss monstery ones that we've seen. The Null Behemoth, or the Behemoth, however it's pronounced. I don't really care, you know what I mean. This guy has a charge and an electric ground pound, which is pretty cool. It's like Shatter, but with sort of area denial electric field on the ground afterwards. That's pretty cool. Could we see a bit more out of the electric beams? Could we see him use a bit more of his physique in actual like combos or something that again could, at higher levels, like a melee combo could lead into the electric ground pound if you let the combo go on too long? Like, yeah, there's a few things you could do with this. Like, what about a almost like a gorilla beating its chest, and that emanates electricity around it in an area. So it's just area denial, but it's like a different way of doing it. Yeah, that could be pretty fun. I like that guy. I want to see what else they can do with that. And thinking of big old boss monsters, I do wonder if they'll do something with the Titan, like we saw in 0 Hour. Like, that I can see being more, again, of a mission on its own, like a boss fight, rather than a boss at the end of a mission, if that makes sense. Like, fighting the Titan could be a mission in itself with all sorts of different objectives. Like, part of the mission is just delaying and distracting it. Then a part of it is actually like breaking off the armor to open up a weak point. And then maybe you actually have to enter the Titan, like in Tourbillon's Destroyer comic, but maybe some members of your team have to rescue civilians or something while this is going on, or you have to complete some very special objectives like find the MacGuffin to plug into the Titan to open the door in the Titan to get to the core of the Titan. You know what I mean? Like video game stuff. Rigmarole that you have to go through to complete your task, like making it more interesting and less simple than kill the big thing. I mean, fuck it, why don't we make Null Hector into a crazy tentacle boss monster? Depends on whether he's becoming a hero or not. It could be really interesting for him to be purely story and have his own boss fight, etc, etc. Be a cool way to tease a hero as well, actually, to give them a boss mission before they're actually released. Paves the way for actual existing game characters to be bosses as well. I think that is definitely somewhere where you could go with this in the future. And that's all the units from Null Sector that we've seen. The only one I can think to mention now of any interest to Null Sector would be the Gwishin. I think it'd be very interesting to see if they are actually allied with Null Sector and whether they're keeping their own faction distinct within that, whether they have their own units with their own fighting style, especially like the tentacly flying monstrosity things like the Sentinels. Definitely try and get them in with Null Sector somehow. Like, the trailer showed that there is at least a mission to be gone to towards South Korea, I'm sure. And I'm pretty confident it actually has a Null Sector logo by it. So the Gwishin allying with Null Sector would be really interesting. It'd be nice to see them develop some of the factions of Omnics within how Null Sector works, and if they're not as amalgamated as it might seem. And so with that, I've been Euclidean Vision. I will hopefully see you in the second part of this video, where I discuss my own potential ideas for Null Sector units. Thanks for staying with me to this point. It's always a pleasure to get my silly ideas out there. Please do all the YouTube stuff. It's a huge help to little channels like mine. It really does make a difference. Take care of yourselves out there, teammates, and may the glorious light of Bastille shine within you. Bye bye.